The first thing Captain Jaren Koss noticed when consciousness dragged him back from the void was that his left boot was missing. Not damaged, not melted by plasma fire, just gone, as if the universe had decided that facing the end of humanity's greatest military disaster required him to do so with one bare foot. The second thing he noticed was that Lieutenant Chen was dead. Her hand still frozen on the tactical display she'd been operating when the Ashari counterattack had turned their flagship into an expensive coffin. Jaren pulled himself upright, his ribs screaming protests that suggested at least 3 were cracked, and took stock of what remained of the Valiant's command bridge. The main viewport had shattered into a spiderweb of fractures, each crack framing a different angle of the catastrophe unfolding outside. Pieces of the 3rd Expeditionary Fleet tumbled past like autumn leaves. If autumn leaves cost 3 billion credits each and contained the frozen corpses of people he'd shared breakfast with that morning. The dreadnought Indomitable was breaking apart along her spine, her reactor core venting plasma in a display that would have been beautiful if it wasn't so horrifically final. Well, he muttered, tasting copper and what he desperately hoped was just engine coolant. That could have gone better. His neural implant chimed. The fact that it still functioned felt like the universe's idea of a sick joke, and informed him that of the 512 vessels that had translated into a Shara Prime system approximately 7 hours ago, 17 were still technically intact. Technically being the operative word, since most of those were drifting hulks with life support reading 0 across the board. The invasion was supposed to be humanity's triumphant return to interstellar relevance. 2 decades of preparation, every shipyard from Mars to Titan running triple shifts, the greatest armada Earth had ever assembled. Intelligence reports suggested the Ashari, despite their advanced technology, numbered only in the millions across their 3 worlds. Humanity had billions, and the desperate mathematics of a dying solar system didn't leave room for polite requests. Jaren had argued against the invasion in every strategic meeting they'd let him attend. He'd been overruled by people wearing more medals than sense, people who'd never actually fought anything more dangerous than budget committees. Now those people were either dead or would be in approximately 12 minutes when their ship's life support finally gave up. The communications console sparked and died, then inexplicably flickered back to life. A voice emerged from the static, clear, cold, speaking Earth Standard with an accent that suggested she'd learned it from watching humanity's propaganda broadcasts. Captain Jaren Koss of the S Valiant, you will descend to the surface, alone, unarmed, immediately. He stared at the console. Outside, another chunk of humanity's future dissolved into expanding debris. His mouth was dry, his head pounding, and he was reasonably certain his left kidney had decided to relocate to somewhere near his spine. "I'm sorry," he said to the voice, "but I seem to be experiencing some combat-related cognitive impairment. Did you just invite me to tea?" The silence that followed had weight, as if the speaker was recalibrating her assessment of human intelligence and finding it wanting. "This is not a request, Captain. Shuttle Bay 7 is intact. A vessel has been prepared. You have 20 minutes. And if I refuse this extremely suspicious invitation, then I will demonstrate what restraint I have shown thus far." Through the broken viewport, Jaren could see Ashara Prime rotating serenely below, a world of dark continents and amber oceans, its cities gleaming like obsidian jewelry scattered across volcanic plains. Not a single mark on it. 500 ships had thrown everything humanity possessed at that planet, and the surface looked like it was preparing for a tourism brochure photo shoot. "The thing is," Jaren said, pulling himself toward the navigation station and immediately regretting it as his ribs reminded him they existed, "I'm having a truly spectacular day already. My fleet is decorating local space. I've lost a boot, and I'm pretty sure my spine is held together by spite and optimism. So forgive me if I'm not enthusiastic about walking into what is obviously either an execution or something worse." "Captain Koss," The voice didn't rise, but something in it made the functional displays flicker. You invaded our space. You ignored 17 years of warnings. You fired upon civilian orbital stations. And you did this because your species has the strategic foresight of a particularly aggressive fungus. I am offering you an alternative to watching Earth become a second asteroid belt. I suggest you accept. He should have felt fear. Terror would have been appropriate. Instead, Jaren found himself laughing, a slightly unhinged sound that echoed off dead consoles and Chen's frozen face. You know what? Sure, why not? It's not like this day can get worse. He started limping toward the exit, then paused. Can I at least get my boot back? Shuttle Bay 7, 19 minutes. The connection died. Jaren stood there for a moment, surrounded by the wreckage of humanity's ambitions, then hobbled toward the access corridor. As he passed Chen's station, he paused to close her eyes, a gesture that felt both necessary and utterly inadequate. Shuttle Bay 7 was a chaos of emergency lighting and vented atmosphere, but true to the voice's word, a single personnel shuttle sat in the launch cradle, its systems already primed. No weapons, no armor, just enough fuel to reach the surface and absolutely no margin for changing his mind. Jaren sealed himself in, initiated launch protocols, and felt the shuttle kick free of the dying ship. As he fell toward the planet, he kept his eyes on the viewport, watching the graveyard of the Third Expeditionary Fleet recede into orbital distance. Somewhere down there, someone was waiting. Someone who had just reduced humanity's military might to scrap metal, and still found it necessary to summon one traumatized captain with asymmetrical footwear. The atmosphere began buffeting the shuttle, amber clouds wreathing the viewport in fire. Jaren gripped the control yoke and tried not to think about what waited below. He failed completely. The shuttle touched down on a landing platform that looked like someone had carved it from a single piece of volcanic glass, then polished it until it could double as a mirror. Jaren sat in the pilot's seat for a full 30 seconds, staring at his reflection in the obsidian surface below, bruised, bleeding from a cut above his left eye, and still missing that damned boot. He looked like he'd lost a fight with a recycling compressor, which, in a sense, he had. The canopy unsealed with a hiss that sounded inappropriately cheerful given the circumstances. Warm air rushed in, carrying scents he couldn't identify, something like cinnamon mixed with ozone and a hint of sulfur. Not unpleasant, just aggressively alien. A reminder that he was very far from home and very much at someone else's mercy. Right then, he muttered, unstrapping himself and immediately regretting the movement as his ribs staged a formal protest. Let's go meet the woman who just deleted humanity's military future. I'm sure this will be perfectly civilized, and not at all result in my various component parts being separated for scientific study. The platform extended into a courtyard, surrounded by buildings that defied every architectural principle Jaren had learned at the Naval Academy. They curved in ways that suggested the architects had a complicated relationship with gravity, their surfaces catching the amber light of Ashara's sun and refracting it into colors that probably had names in languages humans hadn't discovered yet. In the distance, he could see what had to be the palace, a massive structure of dark stone and crystalline spires that seemed to grow organically from the volcanic bedrock. No guards appeared. No weapons tracked his movement. The silence felt deliberately staged, as if someone wanted him to understand exactly how little threat he represented. Jaren limped forward, his bare foot finding the obsidian pleasantly warm against his skin, and followed the only path available, a walkway lined with plants that glowed with soft bioluminescence despite the daylight. Of course they have glowing plants, he said to nobody in particular. Why wouldn't they? They've got everything else. Probably have matter replicators and immortality serums in the bathroom cabinets. The path led to an entrance large enough to accommodate a small starship, its doors standing open in what Jaren recognized as a calculated psychological move. Everything about this approach was designed to make him feel small, insignificant, utterly at the mercy of powers he couldn't comprehend. It was working magnificently. The interior hit him like a physical force, not because of its size, though the throne hall stretched away into shadow distances, but because of how it felt. The walls weren't just black stone. They were obsidian that seemed to drink light and reflect distorted images simultaneously. Jaren caught glimpses of himself repeated infinitely in the dark surfaces, each reflection showing him from slightly different angles, none of them flattering. Above, the ceiling vanished into darkness, but he could see stars. Whether real or projected, he couldn't tell. And through crystalline viewing ports that ran the length of the hall, he watched pieces of his fleet continue their slow orbital decay. She stood at the far end, backlit by one of those impossible windows, and Jaren's brain stuttered trying to process what his eyes reported. The intelligence briefings had used the term humanoid extensively. They'd mentioned the Ashari's similarity to Earth baseline morphology. What they hadn't mentioned, what no dry tactical report could possibly convey, was the profound wrongness of someone who looked almost human but definitively wasn't. Her skin was the color of ash after a fire has burned through everything combustible, a gray that seemed to exist in a spectrum humans didn't quite have receptors for. Hair fell past her shoulders in a cascade so black it appeared to have depth, as if he could fall into it and tumble through dimensional spaces. She wore armor that was clearly ceremonial but equally clearly functional, its surface bearing fresh scoring that made his stomach drop. He knew those patterns. He'd watched his ship's main battery fire in the desperate final minutes of the battle, had watched the plasma bolts streak toward what they'd thought was a command station. Those weren't scorch marks from just any weapon. Those were from the Valiant's last shot, a weapon designed to crack continents. She'd been there. She'd stood in the path of humanity's most powerful weapon, and she had the marks to prove she'd survived. But it was her ears that kept drawing his attention. Long, elegant, sweeping back from her skull in graceful points that should have looked ridiculous, but instead looked entirely natural. Like evolution had decided that humanity's version was the rough draft, and this was the refinement. And her eyes. Her eyes were the color of molten gold, ancient beyond any measure Jaren had reference for, and they pinned him in place more effectively than any weapon. "Captain Koss," she said, her voice reverberating through the obsidian hall. "How generous of you to accept my invitation." Jaren was supposed to say something diplomatic, something that might salvage what remained of Earth's position. Instead, his mouth operated independently of his brain. "I notice you're wearing my ship's greatest hits. Do you do autographs, or is the whole surviving planetary bombardment thing just a weekend hobby?" The silence that followed could have been measured with geological instruments. Somewhere in the back of his mind, the part of Jaren that had survived officer training was screaming that he just sealed humanity's fate with terminal sarcasm. But the rest of him, the part that had watched good people die for a doomed cause, that was running on pain and shock, and the kind of exhaustion that made everything feel slightly unreal, quite bring itself to care. Her expression didn't change. Those golden eyes studied him like he was a specimen that had just done something unexpected in the laboratory. "You're either very brave," she said slowly, "or you've sustained more neural damage than your medical readings suggest." "Can it be both? I've always been an overachiever." He gestured at the viewing ports with their orbital graveyard display, though clearly not as much of an overachiever as whoever designed your planetary defenses. "That's some impressive work, really thorough. 5 stars would get completely obliterated again. You find humor appropriate at this moment. I find humor appropriate at most moments. It's either laugh or cry, and crying makes my broken ribs hurt worse." Jaren took a step forward, his bare foot slapping against polished stone. "Look, Your Majesty, Highness, Supreme Overlord, sorry, nobody provided me with the proper forms of address before my diplomatic mission got explosively interrupted. I'm going to be honest with you. I'm in significant pain. I'm missing a boot for reasons the universe has declined to explain, and I've had what you might call a challenging morning. So if you're going to kill me, arrest me, or dissect me for science, I'd appreciate it if we could move things along. I've got a headache the size of a dreadnought, and the prognosis is only getting worse." She moved then, descending from her throne with a grace that made his clumsy, limping approach look even more pathetic by comparison. As she came closer, Jaren realized she was tall, not towering, but enough that he had to look up slightly to maintain eye contact. The scorch marks on her armor were even more pronounced up close, and he could smell ozone and something else, something that reminded him of lightning strikes and burning metal. "You invaded my world," she said, and her voice carried a fury that made the obsidian walls hum in sympathetic resonance. "You brought 500 vessels of war to my threshold. You fired upon civilian structures. You killed 17,000 of my people in your opening salvo." The humor drained out of Jaren like air from a breached hull. 17,000. The intelligence reports had said the orbital stations were military installations, lightly populated, acceptable collateral. Intelligence had been catastrophically wrong about many things, apparently. He started, but she wasn't finished. "And yet I am told that you argued against this invasion, that you opposed it in every strategic council, that you predicted accurately that it would end in exactly this manner." Her head tilted slightly, those long ears catching the light. "Why did you come, Captain, if you knew it would fail?" "Because," Jaren said quietly, the weight of 7 hours pressing down on him, "my species is dying, and desperate people make terrible choices. And because when the orders came, I was still enough of a soldier to follow them, even knowing they were wrong." She studied him for a long moment, something flickering behind those ancient eyes that might have been recognition or might have been contempt. Then her hand moved toward a crystalline control surface that pulsed with barely contained energy, and every instinct Jaren possessed started screaming. Her finger hovered over the control surface, and Jaren watched energy patterns dance beneath the crystalline matrix like caged lightning. The holographic displays that materialized around them showed Earth, not as he'd last seen it, struggling beneath a dimming sun, but as it would look from Ashara Prime's long-range sensors. A blue marble wrapped in clouds and hope, and 8 billion people who had no idea their collective fate was currently balanced on one alien woman's decision. "Do you know what this does, Captain?" Velisara asked, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone explaining something to a child who'd just broken an expensive vase. "I'm going to guess nothing good based on the ominous glowing and the fact that you're showing me my homeworld while discussing it. This control connects to the relativistic impactor array we positioned in your solar system approximately 4 years ago. One gesture, and Earth becomes a debris field. Your moon follows 6 hours later. Mars another 12 hours after that." She paused, letting the mathematics of extinction settle over him. "We detected your fleet preparations early, you see. We tried to warn you." 17 years of increasingly urgent transmissions, each one ignored or dismissed as alien propaganda. Jaren's throat had gone dry. 4 years ago, you've had a gun to our head for 4 years. We've had multiple guns to your head for 4 years. The impactor array is merely the most dramatic option. Her hand moved slightly, and the display shifted to show weapons platforms he recognized from the battle, the things that had carved through humanity's fleet like scissors through tissue paper. These defense satellites were constructed from materials we mined from your own Kuiper belt. We used your system's resources to build the instruments of your potential destruction. The irony seemed appropriate. "You've got a very particular sense of humor for someone lecturing me about invasion ethics." The temperature in the throne hall dropped noticeably. Velisara's golden eyes fixed on him with an intensity that suggested he'd just used up whatever goodwill his previous honesty had purchased. "I am 3,417 years old, Captain Koss. I have watched 62 species achieve spaceflight. 41 of them still exist. The other 21 made choices similar to yours. They encountered something they didn't understand, decided violence was the appropriate response, and discovered that the universe grades on a very unforgiving curve. Her finger drifted closer to the control. Your species has the arrogance of children playing with antimatter. You found a dying star, calculated that you needed new worlds, and decided that asking politely was somehow beneath you. In our defense, Jaren said, his survival instincts apparently on permanent vacation, your response time on those transmissions was terrible. 17 years of warnings. Our politicians have the attention span of caffeinated squirrels. You needed to send something more attention-grabbing. Fireworks maybe, holographic displays, a singing telegram. A singing telegram. I'm just saying, interstellar communication is tricky. You've got to account for your audience's limitations. Velisara stared at him like he'd just sprouted a second head, and for a moment, Jaren genuinely couldn't tell if she was about to vaporize Earth or laugh. Her hand remained hovering over the control, trembling slightly, though whether from rage or restraint he couldn't determine. "You're aware that I could end your species right now," she said slowly. "I'm extremely aware. It's pretty much the only thing I'm thinking about, if I'm being honest. That and the fact that I really wish I'd found my boot before this meeting." "Why do you keep mentioning the boot?" "Because focusing on the missing boot is more manageable than focusing on the potential extinction of my entire species. It's called compartmentalization. We humans are very good at it. It's probably why we're in this mess to begin with." Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, but a microscopic relaxation of the rigid fury she'd been maintaining. Her hand moved away from the control, and Jaren felt his lungs remember how to function properly. "You're not what I expected," Velisara said, and now she was circling him, her footsteps silent on the obsidian floor. The tactical profiles suggested humanity's military leadership would be different. More dignified, more threatening, better at keeping track of footwear. More like the others. The 41 species that survived their first contact protocols all had leaders who understood diplomacy, who approached the unknown with curiosity rather than weapons. She stopped in front of him, close enough that he could see the way light reflected off her ash-gray skin, creating patterns that seemed to shift and flow. "The 21 that didn't survive sent people like your admirals, convinced that superior firepower could overcome any obstacle, certain that their ignorance was somehow strength." "So why am I here?" Jaren asked. "If you've already categorized humanity as one of the doomed 21, why not just activate your relativistic whatever-tis and save yourself the conversation?" Velisara was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting to the viewing ports where the debris of his fleet continued its slow, orbital ballet. When she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its imperial distance. "Because you argued against the invasion. Because in every simulation we ran of your species' decision-making process, there was always a small percentage who chose differently, who saw past the immediate desperation to the longer consequences." She turned back to him, and those ancient eyes carried something he hadn't expected, uncertainty. "Because perhaps I've grown weary of being proven right about species' capacity for self-destruction." That's surprisingly optimistic for someone who just spent the morning committing fleet-scale homicide. Is it homicide when someone breaks into your home and begins shooting? Your laws have words for justified response, I believe. Self-defense usually doesn't extend to having doomsday weapons pre-positioned in the attacker's living room. Perhaps your laws need updating for an interstellar context. They stared at each other, and Jaren realized with a start that they were arguing. Actually arguing, like this was a debate in the officers' mess rather than a conversation between conqueror and conquered. Velisara seemed to realize it too, because something flickered across her face that might have been surprise or might have been something more complicated. "I could send you back," she said abruptly. "Put you on a shuttle, let you return to what remains of your fleet, carry warning to Earth that the next invasion will not end with simply destroying military assets. But that would require trusting that your species has learned from this disaster. And I have 3,000 years of evidence suggesting that violent species rarely learn from anything except overwhelming personal loss. Her hand didn't move toward the control again, but Jaren could feel the threat of it hanging in the air between them. So instead, Captain Jaren Koss, I am going to offer you a different choice. I'm absolutely thrilled to hear it, he said, and meant it despite everything. Any choice that didn't involve Earth becoming a debris field was automatically his favorite option. You will stay here, on Ashara Prime, in my court, as the living symbol of Earth's surrender and the price of your species' arrogance. Jaren blinked. I'm sorry, what? You will remain here as a permanent reminder that humanity attempted to take by force what should have been requested through diplomacy. You will serve as proof that Earth has accepted its defeat and will not attempt further aggression. You want to keep me as, what, a trophy, a pet, a really depressing conversation piece for state dinners. I want, Velisara said, and her voice cracked slightly on the word, so subtle he almost missed it. A guarantee that what happens next doesn't require me to destroy an entire planet. And I want your species to understand, truly understand, what they've lost by choosing violence. Jaren looked at the viewing ports, at the burning remains of 500 ships and dreams of salvation. He looked at the control that could end everything Earth had ever been. He looked at Velisara, 3,000 years old and standing in armor scarred by humanity's last desperate shot, and he saw something in her expression that terrified him more than any weapon. The hairline fracture in her composure that spoke of wounds that had nothing to do with this morning's battle. Do I get my own room? He asked. Or is this more of a live in the dungeon situation? Her eyes widened slightly, as if she'd expected anything but that response. You're accepting. I'm accepting that Earth is 47 light-years away. I'm one exhausted captain with asymmetrical footwear, and you're holding every single card in this negotiation. So yes, your Imperial Majesty, I'll be your living symbol of humanity's terrible decision-making. He attempted something like a bow, which his ribs immediately vetoed. Though I'm going to need medical attention, a proper boot, and possibly a very strong drink, preferably in that order. Velisara stared at him for 3 full seconds, then did something that made the obsidian walls ring with acoustic surprise. She laughed. Jaren woke to the sound of something that definitely shouldn't exist making noises outside his window. He'd been on Ashara Prime for 6 days, or what passed for days on a planet with a 28-hour rotation, and he still hadn't adapted to the local wildlife's complete disregard for Earth-based biological conventions. This particular creature sounded like a bird had mated with a brass section, and the offspring had strong opinions about the morning. His quarters turned out to be less dungeon and more luxury suite designed by someone who'd never met a right angle they couldn't curve. The walls shifted color with the ambient light, currently displaying something between deep blue and purple that his brain kept trying to categorize as a color that didn't technically exist. Through the window, if it was actually a window and not some kind of holographic projection, he still hadn't determined which. He could see gardens where plants glowed with bioluminescence even in what passed for daylight. The medical attention had happened on day 1, courtesy of an Ashari physician who'd looked at his injuries with the professional disdain of someone dealing with a patient who'd attempted physical combat with a star cruiser. The regeneration therapy had left him feeling like his bones were made of carbonated water for 12 hours, but at least his ribs had stopped trying to puncture his lungs every time he breathed. The boot situation remained unresolved. Apparently, tracking down one missing piece of human footwear in the wreckage of a fleet wasn't high on anyone's priority list. A soft chime indicated someone was at his door, the Ashari version of knocking, which sounded like wind chimes crossed with whale song. Jaren pulled on the robe they'd provided, which was comfortable in a way that suggested the fabric might be sentient and actively trying to optimize his body temperature. "Come in," he called, then remembered that the translation implant they'd installed might not cover colloquial phrases. "I mean, enter. Access granted. The door is yours to open." The door slid aside to reveal not a guard or servant, but Velisara herself, wearing something less martial than the armor he'd seen before, but no less impressive. The effect was somewhat undermined by the fact that she was holding what appeared to be a data tablet and frowning at it like it had personally insulted her. "Good morning, Captain Koss. I hope the accommodations are adequate." "They're spectacular. The bed actively adjusts to my spine. The bathroom has more functions than my last ship, and something outside my window sounds like it's auditioning for an experimental jazz orchestra. I'm living better than I did as a fleet captain." "Good. You'll need your energy. We have much to discuss." She gestured at the tablet. "Your presence here has created something of a diplomatic situation." I'd have thought my presence here was already a diplomatic situation by definition. "More complicated than anticipated. 3 of the major Ashari houses are demanding your immediate execution as a war criminal. 2 others want you turned over to them for interrogation. One particularly entrepreneurial group has offered to purchase you for what I can only describe as specimen study, which I've declined on ethical grounds that apparently make me soft." Jaren sat down on the edge of his bed, which immediately adjusted itself to support him in 17 different ways. "I appreciate the ethical concerns. Very kind of you to not sell me to mad scientists." "Additionally," Velisara continued, apparently on a roll now, "Earth has been attempting to contact us nonstop. Your government appears to be cycling through every possible combination of threats, bribes, and desperate pleas. Yesterday they offered us exclusive mining rights to Saturn's moons if we return you safely. Today they've escalated to threatening to detonate their entire remaining nuclear arsenal in a display of defiance. That's actually pretty on brand for Earth's political leadership. When in doubt, threaten mutual annihilation. Your species has fascinating survival instincts." She set the tablet down on a side table that probably cost more than Jaren's childhood home. "But that's not why I'm here. I need your help with something." That made him pause. "You need my help. You, the 3,000-year-old Empress who deleted my fleet before lunch, need help from me, the guy who still can't figure out how your toilet works." The bidet functionality is intuitive once you understand the gestural interface. "The bidet has gestures. Why does the bidet need gestures?" Velisara's mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. There and gone so quickly he might have imagined it. She moved to the window, her long ears catching the strange light from outside, and stared out at the gardens. "I've been reviewing your species' cultural databases," she said quietly. "The ones we intercepted from your fleet's communication logs. Music, literature, art, social customs. Do you know what I found most fascinating? Our ability to create reality television. Because I'd like to apologize for that in advance. Your species' relationship with time. You live perhaps 80 years if you're fortunate, barely long enough to accumulate meaningful wisdom before you cease to exist. And yet you create art meant to outlast you. You build institutions intended for generations you'll never meet. You act as if you'll live forever despite knowing with absolute certainty that you won't." Jaren had no idea where this was going, but something in her tone made him keep quiet. "I've lived for 34 centuries, Captain. I've watched your planet since your ancestors were painting on cave walls. I've seen species rise and fall, civilizations bloom and collapse. I've outlived friends, advisors, lovers, entire generations of people who mattered to me." She turned back to him, and those golden eyes carried a weight that made his chest tight. "Do you know what that teaches you? That immortality is overrated. That nothing matters. That every connection is temporary, every achievement eventually dust, every moment of joy merely postponing the inevitable entropy of existence. Her hands tightened on the window frame. And then your fleet arrives, full of people with their pathetically short lifespans, fighting desperately to buy their species a few more decades of survival, and I find myself wondering when I stopped feeling that kind of urgency about anything. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to have mass. Jaren stood, his bare foot and booted foot making an asymmetric rhythm on the floor, and joined her at the window. "You know what the worst part of living 80 years is?" he asked. "You spend the first 20 figuring out how to be a person, the next 20 making mistakes, and then you've got maybe 40 years to actually get anything done before your body starts filing complaints about basic functions. We're desperate because we have to be. We don't have the luxury of waiting for the right moment. And yet you still opposed the invasion. Knowing your species was dying, you still argued for patience. Because desperation isn't an excuse for stupidity, and because some mistakes you don't get to learn from, they just end everything." He glanced at her. "You want my help understanding why humanity did something you've seen dozens of other species do. It's simple. We were scared, we were desperate, and we convinced ourselves that being the aggressor was better than being the victim. We were wrong, people died, and now we have to live with that." Velisara was quiet for a long moment, then reached up and did something Jaren absolutely didn't expect. She pushed her hair back from one of those long, elegant ears, revealing a small scar at its base. "I got this in my 43rd year, a training accident. It hurt terribly at the time." Her hand dropped. "I can barely remember the pain now, can barely remember who I was then. That person might as well be a stranger." She looked at him directly. "How do you maintain urgency, Captain, when nothing stays urgent for more than a few decades? When everyone you care about becomes a memory, and even the memories fade?" And there it was, the crack in the Empress's facade wide enough to see through. Jaren understood, suddenly and completely, why he was really here. Not as a trophy or symbol, but as something far more complicated and far more human. "You don't," he said honestly. "You can't. Asking someone to care with the same intensity for 3,000 years is like asking water to stay boiling forever. It's not how the physics works." He paused. "But maybe that's not the right question. Maybe the question is, what would make something feel urgent again?" Velisara turned to face him fully, and he could see something shifting behind those ancient eyes. Surprise, maybe, or recognition, or something else entirely. "You're suggesting I'm keeping you here because you remind me of what urgency feels like. I'm suggesting that you destroyed my fleet in 7 hours when you could have done it in 7 minutes. That you're negotiating with my planet instead of just activating your doomsday array. That you're standing in my room at what I'm guessing is an inappropriate hour for an empress to be visiting prisoners, asking philosophical questions about the nature of caring." He met her gaze. "Yeah, I think I remind you of something. I'm just not sure either of us wants to examine what that something is." The brass section bird thing outside chose that moment to reach a crescendo that made the windows vibrate. Velisara glanced at it, then back at Jaren, and this time the smile was unmistakable. "That's a Keshari. They only sing when they're trying to attract a mate. Usually unsuccessfully, they're tone-deaf as a species." "Finally," Jaren said, "something I can relate to on this planet." She laughed again, that same surprised sound from the throne room, and Jaren realized with growing certainty that he'd just made his captivity infinitely more complicated than a simple prisoner and captor relationship had any right to be. The alarm came at what Jaren had started thinking of as "O Dark Hundred a Sharon time." That special hour when even the glowing plants seemed to be questioning their life choices. He rolled out of bed with the reflexes of someone who'd spent 20 years responding to crisis alerts, then remembered he wasn't a captain anymore, and had no actual responsibilities beyond existing as a diplomatic inconvenience. The alarm kept screaming anyway. He found Velisara already on the palace balcony, her armor back on and gleaming with active defensive fields. staring at a holographic display that showed things Jaren's brain immediately categorized as extremely bad news. Ships were dropping out of FTL at the system's edge. Not human designs, but something older, meaner, covered in angular geometry that suggested their builders had very strong opinions about the universe, and most of them were violent. "Please tell me those are just very aggressive tourists," he said, joining her at the railing. "Crethori raiders. They monitor civilizations for electromagnetic signatures of large-scale conflict, then arrive to scavenge the aftermath." She manipulated the display, and the image zoomed to show scarred hulls bristling with weapons that looked like they'd been designed by a committee of sadists. "Your fleet's death screams drew them from 15 light-years away. So this is technically our fault. Great. Humanity's gift to the galaxy. We brought space pirates to your doorstep." Jaren studied the ships, his tactical training automatically counting vectors and calculating approach times. "How bad is this?" "Manageable if they're just here for salvage. Catastrophic if they decide Ashara Prime itself looks appetizing." She turned to him, and he saw something in her expression he hadn't seen before, uncertainty mixed with exhaustion. "I've fought the Crethori before. 300 years ago they tested our borders. We repelled them, but the cost was significant. 300 years ago you were what, barely 2,000, positively youthful." "I'm being serious, Jaren." The use of his first name hit him like a physical thing. "In the 3 weeks he'd been here." Yes, 3 weeks now, long enough that he'd stopped counting days and started counting conversations. She'd maintained careful formality except in their increasingly frequent late-night discussions about philosophy, mortality, and why human coffee was objectively superior to Ashari stimulant beverages. "I know you are," he said quietly. "What do you need?" Velisara studied him for a long moment, then did something that made his heart skip several beats. She pulled up a secondary display showing Earth's remaining military assets. 4 functional destroyers, a dozen corvettes, and what looked like a hastily assembled defense platform orbiting Luna. "Earth has been broadcasting threats at me for 3 weeks, demanding your return, threatening retaliation, generally behaving like a wounded animal cornered in a cave." Her fingers moved through the holographic interface. "But their fleet isn't positioned for attack anymore. It's positioned for defense. They've pulled everything back to protect the homeworld. Because they're terrified you're going to activate that relativistic impactor array you keep mentioning at parties." "I've never mentioned it at parties. We don't have parties." "We should fix that. Parties might help with your 3,000-year burnout situation." He paused. "But seriously, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," Velisara said slowly, "that those Crethori raiders scan every system they enter. And if they detect that Earth is vulnerable, defended by only a handful of ships with a terrified population below, they'll mark it for future harvest." She met his eyes. "I'm thinking that perhaps it's time to demonstrate to your species, and to the predators circling in the dark, that some things have changed." Jaren felt something shift in his chest, something that felt dangerously close to hope. "You want to help Earth. I want to establish that this region of space is under Ashari protection, which, as of 3 weeks ago when I decided to keep you alive instead of executing you, technically includes your homeworld." Her mouth quirked. "Consider it an extended warranty on the life of one extremely frustrating human who still hasn't learned how to properly operate a bidet. The gestures are counterintuitive, and you know it." The moment broke with another alarm, this one indicating the Crethori were accelerating toward the inner system. Velisara's expression shifted back to Imperial Command mode, and Jaren watched her become something other than the lonely woman who'd been asking him about the nature of urgency. She became the weapon that had erased his fleet, focused and absolutely terrifying. "I need you to open a channel to Earth," she said. "Direct communication, command-level encryption. Can you do that?" Assuming they haven't changed all the codes in a fit of paranoia, yes. What am I telling them? That the Ashari Imperium is extending provisional protection over Earth's solar system. That any vessel attempting to enter Sol space without authorization will be treated as hostile. And that Captain Jaren Koss vouches for humanity's willingness to enter into proper diplomatic relations, instead of immediately shooting at things they don't understand. That last part might be optimistic. Then perhaps you should phrase it more diplomatically. You have 5 minutes while I deploy the defense grid. She strode off toward the command center, leaving Jaren alone on the balcony with the weight of his species' future suddenly dumped in his lap. He pulled up the communication interface, which he'd figured out in week 2, mostly by accident, and with the help of a sympathetic palace technician who found human confusion adorable, and started composing what was probably the most important message he'd ever sent. The channel opened, and Admiral Petrov's face appeared, looking like she'd aged 10 years in 3 weeks. Behind her, Jaren could see Earth Command's Operations Center in full crisis mode. Koss, Jaren Koss. What the hell, we thought you were dead or worse. I'm fine, Admiral, relatively speaking, but we've got a situation. He quickly outlined the Krethori threat, Velisara's offer, and the new political reality of Earth being under Ashari protection whether they liked it or not. To Petrov's credit, she only interrupted twice to ask if he'd been brainwashed. So let me understand this, she said finally. The aliens who destroyed our fleet 3 weeks ago are now offering to protect us from different aliens. That's the extremely simplified version, yes. And you trust this Empress, the one who kept you as a hostage. Jaren thought about late-night conversations in the palace gardens, about watching someone 3,000 years old remember what it felt like to care about something, about the way Velisara's hand had trembled when she pulled it away from the control that could have ended Earth. I trust that she's tired of watching species destroy themselves. I trust that she's looking for reasons to believe isolation isn't the only option. And I trust that right now, those Krethori ships are a much bigger threat than wounded pride. Petrov was quiet for a moment, then nodded. Stand by, I need to conference with the council. The channel muted, and Jaren watched through the palace's viewing ports as Asharan defense satellites began deploying, forming geometric patterns that looked like someone had taught mathematics to be aggressive. In the distance, he could see the Krethori ships adjusting course, probably recalculating their assessment of easy pickings. Velisara's voice came through on a private channel. How's it going with Earth? They're deciding whether accepting help from you is worse than being space pirate food. Humanity excels at difficult decisions. You're handling this well, the diplomatic part I mean. I'm handling this terribly, and we both know it. I'm a fleet captain, not an ambassador. You're someone who argued against war when war was popular. Someone who accepted captivity to save his planet. Someone who makes me laugh at 4 in the morning when I'm explaining why immortality is exhausting. Her voice softened. You're exactly what this moment needs, Jaren. The channel to Earth reopened before he could figure out how to respond to that. Petrov's expression had shifted from suspicious to carefully neutral. The Council has authorized provisional acceptance of Ashari protection, pending formal treaty negotiations. We're transmitting our current defensive positions and threat assessments. Understood, Admiral. I'll relay to Empress Velisara. And Koss, for what it's worth, we're glad you're alive. The channel closed. Jaren stood there on the balcony, watching Asharan and the few remaining human vessels begin coordinating their defense, and felt something he hadn't felt since the invasion. Not hope exactly, but its foundation. The sense that maybe, possibly, the future didn't have to end in fire. Velisara found him an hour later, after the Krethori had taken one look at the combined defense grid and decided to try their luck elsewhere. She'd removed her armor, and she looked tired in a way that suggested even 3,000 years of experience didn't make crisis management easy. They're gone, she said. For now. For now is better than we're all dead. Your optimism is refreshing. She joined him at the railing, and her hand found his. ash-gray fingers intertwining with human flesh in a gesture that should have felt alien but somehow didn't. Your planet wants you back. We've started preliminary treaty discussions, and they've formally requested your return as part of the good faith negotiations. Jaren's stomach dropped, and I told them you'd make your own choice. Because despite what they think, you're not my prisoner. You haven't been for a while now. He looked at their joined hands, then at the gardens below where Keshari birds were attempting their tone-deaf serenades, then at Velisara's face, ancient and young simultaneously, carrying 3,000 years of loneliness and 3 weeks of something that might be healing. If I go back, he said slowly, Earth gets their war hero returned. Diplomatic relations start on better footing. Everything proceeds properly and officially. Yes, and if I stay, then I have to explain to multiple governments why I'm keeping you here when there's no strategic reason to do so. It will be diplomatically complicated, personally questionable, and probably start 17 new rumors about my judgment. That sounds terrible, Jaren said and didn't let go of her hand. Absolutely terrible. When do we tell them? Velisara's smile was small but genuine, and for the first time since he'd met her, it reached those ancient golden eyes. Tomorrow. Tonight, I thought you might help me understand this coffee beverage you keep mentioning, and perhaps explain more about why your species creates art meant to outlast them. That's a long conversation. Fortunately, she said, squeezing his hand gently, I have time. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, and somewhere in the darkness between them, the future waited, uncertain, unprecedented, and no longer quite so lonely.